Good morning. Good to see you. And we are, it is really fun and interesting, fascinating to me to be going through the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew, even while I'm studying and preaching through Luke, to see how each evangelist, by that we mean each author of one of the Gospels, has a particular perspective. He's looking at Jesus, the ministry of Jesus, to emphasize a certain thing to a certain audience. Now, all the Word of God is for everybody, but there are certain aspects of it that resonate with different segments. Matthew's gospel is very, very Jewish. It has a very Jewish background. There is speculation. Some of the early church fathers claimed that Matthew had written an earlier gospel in Hebrew. We don't know that. We do know that there was a thing circulating around called the Logia, the sayings of Jesus, and we know that all of the evangelists, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and later John, all had different sources. They had, in Matthew's case and John's case, they had their eyewitness testimony. They had seen some of these things themselves. Matthew, of course, wouldn't have known about the visit of the Magi, except somebody told him, very possibly Mary. Same thing with Luke. Luke, what he tells us in those infancy narratives, he had to get that from somewhere. In fact, Luke, as a Gentile, he was not one of the disciples. So all of his source materials come from something other than his own eyewitness testimony. But Matthew is also known as Levi. He's one of the 12. Mark had as his primary source, apparently, the Apostle Peter. He writes a lot from Peter's perspective, and in some ways he's harder on Peter than the other evangelists. So these things are never contradictory. That is when we properly understand them. But there are differences of emphasis. Sometimes it looks like they're saying two different things, when in reality they're saying really the same thing. I'm trying to remember. I cannot remember the name. Anybody remember the name of Donald Trump's current nominee for Attorney General? He was the Attorney General under George Bush. Mark what? Barr? Bob Barr? Or what's the first name? Anybody know? You're saying Bob, Dave, right? Yes. Bob Barr. He was George W.'s Attorney General, and now Trump is nominating him. So if you read something about him 200 years from now, and it said about this guy, well, he was George W. Bush's Attorney General. You read somebody else say, well, he was Donald Trump's Attorney General. What would you say? Oh, well, these guys disagree. Do they? Do they disagree? They don't disagree. They're each telling a true thing that, they're just not telling the whole thing. And you see that a lot in the Gospels where we're going to see in Luke today, for instance, Luke emphasizes a part of Isaiah 40. When he quotes John the Baptist comes in fulfillment of Isaiah 40, he quotes a much more extended part of the passage, where both Mark and Matthew just quote a shorter version of the passage. And Luke does that because he's getting down there to the part of that passage that says, all flesh will see it. Because Luke's emphasizing the gospel is universal. The gospel is for the Gentiles. He's a Gentile. He's writing to a Gentile audience. Now, does Matthew disagree with that? No, he doesn't disagree with that. There are places in Matthew where he talks about the fact that the gospel's for not just the Jews, but it's not his primary emphasis. So they don't disagree. They're just emphasizing different things. The Sermon on the Mount is a specific content and a specific place. Jesus, by the shores of the Sea of Galilee, gives this sermon. There is in Luke very, very similar material when we get there, and it's going to be months before we get there. But we get there in Luke, we're going to talk about it, but there Luke has Jesus giving this sermon on a plane, not a jet plane, but a flat place. Whereas Matthew has him given the sermon on a mountain. Is this a contradiction? Absolutely not. And any preacher who's ever preached the same sermon in two different places and adapted it with different emphases knows exactly what Jesus did. Jesus has several things that he emphasizes. Jesus didn't say truth just one time and then I'm never going to repeat that truth again. He would say something and he would apply it in a certain way. I'll give you an example right in the Sermon on the Mount. I told you last week, as we read the Sermon on the Mount, we're going to look at it it's a series of build up to peaks. And think of it like a mountain range. And as you get closer to it, there are ever higher and higher peaks until you finally get to the Continental Divide, the one that is the highest peak that really divides everything else. And then you cross that and then you're stepping down. And that's exactly the way the Sermon on the Mount functions. So we begin with the Beatitudes. And the Beatitudes sort of step us up. And the peak of the Beatitudes is persecution. How do we know that? Well, what you want to look for when you're studying the Scripture, anytime you see repetition is always, always important. And Jesus repeats himself. He begins the Sermon on the Mount with a series of these repetitions. The most obvious one there is blessed are. Makarios is the Greek word, and Jesus gives us these series of blessed are, blessed are, blessed are. And they are all character qualities, things that you are, things that the Holy Spirit should inculcate in your life. And Jesus, they are somewhat surprising, like he talks about, blessed are the poor in spirit. But you have all these qualities, what you are. When you get to the last one, though, all right, first of all of the first 7 are just one time. He doesn't repeat anything. He doesn't expand it much. It's just it's an apathem. It's just the same. Blessed are the poor in spirit, blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. And everything follows that formula. Now you get to the last one. Well, blessed are you. Okay, this is different. All right, the one thing that signals peak, it's what I call a zone of turbulence. And it's where you find repetition, 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 and then suddenly variation. It's similar, but it's different. Okay, this is like, what I compare it to, it's like watching a horror movie, and the wife, she's in the kitchen, and she's skinning potatoes or whatever with a knife. And she hears a noise in the other room, and she lays down the knife and walks away, and the camera zooms in on the knife. Now, what does this tell you? Look at that. That knife, we're not done with that knife, right? That knife is going to be back. And it's calling your attention to it. It's building tension by pointing it out. Oh, no, the knife is coming back. Someone's going to get the knife. I mean, the thing that she's been using very mundanely, chop, 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 put down the knife, walk away from it. Okay, now the variation. She's gone from this mundane thing in which there's no danger to suddenly, oh, look at that. The director's calling our attention to the knife. And anytime in the scripture you see this repetition, 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 variation, boom. That's the writer going, look at this. This is the thing. And that's what we call peak. I mean, it's building up to something. Here's the real point he's making. And the variation is what we call a zone of turbulence. Think of it another way. I think of it as, when I fly frequently, and especially if you fly to South America, you fly in here, in the north, we get our weather. Our weather comes from west to east, right? You get down around about Cuba, that flips. You watch when hurricanes are coming and hurricane season starting in June, where do they come from? They come from out there in the Atlantic. They come around, down the tropic line there, and then they hit us, and they spin up and then back out to sea typically, because our weather pattern comes from west to east. But when you fly south around Cuba, you're going to get the jet stream changes. It's from east to west. And guess what you're going to feel on that airplane? You're going to feel turbulence. Why? Because you're changing. You're going from the jet stream going one way to going another, and you feel that. These two air masses meeting create this zone of turbulence. That's what you're looking for in Scripture, because it's the author pointing to it and going, look at this, look at this. This is the thing. So in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus is building up to the big peak is the ask, seek, knock portion of the Sermon on the Mount, because he's going to spend a great deal of time telling us we're not righteous. And that's the takeaway from the whole thing. You don't measure up. You don't have this. You're not meek. You're not poor. You're not poor in spirit. You're not meek. And then, and because he says, if you are this, you will be persecuted. So there's the peak. He's changed from the blessed are third person, to suddenly blessed are second person. Blessed are you. When men shall revile you. He doesn't say blessed are the persecuted. No, he's changed. Blessed are you. When men shall revile you and persecute you. Say all manner of evil against you falsely for my sake, for great is your reward in heaven. So Jesus is telling us, if you have these character qualities, it's going to result in persecution. So there's the first peak. And in the Sermon on the Plain, Jesus is using similar material, but he's saying something totally different. There, the ask, seek, knock passage is about prayer. It's about persistence in prayer. And both things are true, both things fit, but in the same way, you'll hear, I can use a sermon illustration and use it to illustrate one thing, but in another sermon, I can take that same story and tell it and then flip it to emphasize a different thing. You could later report on that and say, well, Dr. York used a sermon illustration. They told this story to illustrate such and such. But then elsewhere, you could say, he used this story and he used it to illustrate such and such. Someone might read those two accounts and say, well, you're contradicting yourself. No, you heard me use the same material, but you heard me apply it in two different ways. So the Gospels are full of that. These are not contradictions. These are complementary. They give us a fuller picture of Jesus and what he's doing and the truth he wants us to have. So we see the first series of statements building up to peak in Matthew 5 in the Beatitudes. And it ends with the ethical admonition, rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven, for so they persecuted the prophets who were before you. So just to sort of remind ourselves of what Jesus has done here, he's saying, admit your condition, you're poor in spirit, acknowledge your contrition, mourn over your spiritual poverty, acquiesce your control, be meek by God's power. You're giving God absolute control of your life. You've been meeked like a horse. Horse is not less powerful, but that power is now under control. So that's what meekness is. Alter your craving. Instead of craving the things of the flesh, you're hungering and thirsting for righteousness. Then act in compassion. Show mercy to others as God did to you. And then allow cleanliness. Let Jesus live through you and pure heart and integrity, and accept your calling then as a peacemaker. Be a peacemaker in a world of turmoil, but anticipate your conflict. You will be persecuted. Now, if you don't do that, like if you're claiming to be a follower of Jesus, but you don't have these character qualities, your life is not standing out so that it attracts persecution, then Jesus has a statement to say about that. And this is where we go in verse 13. You are the salt of the earth. But if salt has lost its taste, how shall its saltiness be restored? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled under people's feet. All right, so Jesus is going to use two metaphors here that we're going to look at today, and that is salt and light. And I think in the modern world, we think of salt primarily for one purpose, and that's flavor. You know, when I think of salt, I think of my French fries, and I want salt on my French fries. It's just French fries that have no salt on them are very unsatisfying to me. And I load them up with lots of NaCl. I like it. So when we think about salt, we think only about flavor, and that's one thing. So, but in the ancient world, salt had a much wider use and was very, very important. You can look in history, even really pretty much up to modern history, how important salt is. If you ever saw the movie Gandhi, you ever seen the movie Gandhi? One of the chief conflicts between the Indians and the British was about the right to make salt. And one of the things that Gandhi did to protest the British rule of India was he marched to the sea and then made salt, which was against the law. The British had outlawed letting the Indians make their own salt, and were forcing them to buy British salt. And of course, here they've got their own ocean, so they could easily make salt, but it was against the law, and they saw it as oppressive because it kept them poor and didn't let them have control of their own sustenance. And so salt is extremely important historically. What's happening right now in the government shutdown is people are working, but they are not getting paid a what? A salary. Now guess where that word comes from? It comes from the word salt. Because in the ancient world, especially soldiers, a lot of times got paid in salt. And that's where the word salary comes from. You ever say about somebody, he's not worth his salt. So salt was used as like money. It was a bartering, it had bartering value, and it was incredibly valuable. You could get paid in salt. I mean, it was carted around with armies just like gold in order to pay the soldiers while they're on the march. So salt is historically incredibly valuable. So what is he saying that you as a Christian should do? The very first thing is we would say Christians add value. We add value to the world. And this is why I laugh every time one of these new atheists come out with their books about religion not adding anything to the world. And now Richard Dawkins has backed down on his stuff. He's pretty much he has admitted he's very much anti-Islam. Dawkins is one of the what they call the four horsemen of the apocalypse, the new atheism, and he still totally disbelieves in Christianity. But he says Christians have always brought culture. They have brought kindness. They brought good qualities to most places when they go there. He's very much anti-Muslim, and this has made him, what's funny is now in this new moral climate that here's the guy that was one of the leading intellectuals in Britain is now banned from TV shows, and he's had a lot of speaking engagements canceled. It's hard for him to get a publisher now because in his zeal against religion, he has particularly singled out Islam and believes that it has an insidious effect. And so, of course, that's just not accepted by people today. And so he's really sort of like his own venom is turned on him. But it's interesting to read his analysis of what Christianity has done. And Christians should add value. I mean, the value that Christians have added to the world, our view of beauty, our view of culture, our view of marriage, wherever, Christians were the first ones to talk about women having choice in marriage. I mean, read 1 Corinthians 7. Paul talks about the right of women to stay single or to marry, and that was just unheard of. Paul talks about a woman making a decision whether or not she's going to stay with an unbelieving husband. I mean, the fact that he even has the discussion is radical. So Christianity valued women when no other religion did. Everywhere it's gone, it has eventually gotten rid of slavery, and it's given dignity to women. Yes, there are historic outliers, and many of them in this country certainly, to be sure. But in general, Christianity has always elevated the dignity of people, of all races, and of women and marriage. And we got incredible artwork, everything, now I've got to admit, we Baptists are way behind our Catholic friends. They, there is no Baptist Sistine Chapel out there. I don't even know where we might go to find such a thing. But Christianity itself has, because we do have a sense of beauty and understanding the narrative of the world. So we've added value to the world, and as we should add value. We should live in such a way that any employer in Central Kentucky wants to hire somebody who's a member of Buck Run Baptist Church. They should have a desire. Even a lost person should say, I want one of those people that goes to Buck Run who says they're spirit-filled, because, man, they're worth their salt. They earn their keep. They add value. They really give you hard work, and you can trust them, and they bring a joy to the workplace. And that's the way we should live. We are the salt of the earth. As such, we should add value. Secondly, we should add flavor. So being a Christian means that we should bring flavor to the world. And man, I thank God for all kinds of Christians that bring flavor to the world, to the community, that there's a zest and a zeal. Tanya and I work hard at this. This is one of the ways we want to live, so that when we meet people, that they say, man, you guys look like you're having fun. You guys enjoy life. You seem like you really enjoy one another. What's the secret? And we want to live in such a way that people are asking that question. We want there to be a zest, a zeal, a flavor about our lives. And we want to be the kind of people that add flavor to any group, to any activity. And it's important that we as believers get involved in community efforts, that we cooperate with people who don't see eye to eye with us, just so that we can add flavor to the world. I mean, Christians should be involved in things like the arts and social justice issues. We shouldn't be afraid of that term. We shouldn't be afraid of those activities. This is part of our concern as believers. We should be adding flavor to our world. But also, salt preserves. Now, in a world of refrigeration, we don't use salt like this much anymore, but this is the historic use of salt. One of the most important uses of salt is that when you kill meat, kill an animal, and you salt it. It will preserve the meat. You could pack a barrel with fish in salt, and that salt both dries that fish and preserves it. Bacteria, salt doesn't mold. It doesn't get old. Salt lasts as long as it's in no way compromised by water. It'll keep that form, and it'll keep things fresh and dry, and it preserves, and Christians should preserve. What did Jesus say? Jesus talked about those days not being prolonged. He talks about the days of judgment for the elect's sake. You think about God's view of what he does in this world, how he preserves this world, and his wrath is stayed. Why? Because of the elect's sake, because we preserve this world. Remember Abraham in Genesis praying for Sodom based on how many righteous people are there? And God in every case says to Abraham, yeah, if there are 50, I'll spare them. If there are 45, I'll spare them. If there are 40, I'll spare them. If there are 30, if there are 20, it goes down to 10. Abraham doesn't bargain any lower than that, because now he's down to Lot's family, and Abraham knows that even Lot's family, though they are his family, they're not righteous. God is doing Abraham a favor by sparing them. He would have spared Sodom for 10 righteous people. And so this is what we do. We preserve this world. By our presence, God stays his wrath. God blesses. There's a way that, the Bible talks about unbelieving children in a home where just one parent is a believer, that those children are still sanctified by the believing parent. What does that mean? Well, God sets them apart. There's a care for them. Wednesday night, I taught in Psalm 37, and one of the passages in Psalm 37 says, I've never seen the righteous forsaken nor their seed begging bread. And in his commentary on that verse, Spurgeon talks about, he says, Spurgeon knows the theology of Job. He knows that bad things can happen to good people. But he talks about how rare it is. He says it's so rare that David could say, when he, as an old man, he'd never seen it. And Spurgeon said, I have often thought that the greatest way to leave a legacy to your children is to be poor for Christ's sake. Because I have seen so many children of great preachers and missionaries become incredibly successful and wealthy. And he gave a few examples. And I began to think through that. And I could say the same thing. I know of people who gave their lives on the mission field, and their children grew up and were doctors and businessmen and women and lawyers, and they did incredible things, made a lot of money. And God just had a special grace. His hand was on them. Why? Because of their parents. So Christians, we preserve, we add value, we add flavor to the world. But also salt permeates. It's one of the reasons why when they would sprinkle salt on fish or meat, rub it in, salt permeates that. It goes throughout that. It flavors the entire thing. It preserves it all. And in the same way, you put salt in water, it doesn't just stay in the one part of the water, the glass where you put it, it permeates the whole thing. It diffuses. And so it is with our faith. We permeate the world. We go throughout the world. It is inherent in the Christian faith that we spread our faith, that we tell others the good news, and we invite others to become believers. Because one of the things salt does, it irritates. It burns. You get salt in a wound. When I'm eating those French fries and I've got a hangnail, I like, oh man, burning. I may not even have realized I had a hangnail. Suddenly I've got salt in it, and the burning makes me feel it. So it is that the world can be okay in their sin, and they can feel justified, even sanctified in their sinful choices until Christians come along and we say, no, that's wrong. Now, and for this, we're called bigots and we're called hateful. And man, this is the narrative of the world. That if you say something that really in the past was not controversial, but now it is, to say, there are only two genders. There's a man and a woman. And we can prove this with genitalia. We can prove this with DNA. And this is what the world has known and believed for millennia. This has not even been controversial. But suddenly now, if you say that, oh, you irritate. You burn. We don't want you. We want to get rid of you. And that's part of being salt. And this is why Jesus said, if you live like this in those Beatitudes, what? You're going to be persecuted. Now, he warns, though, that it's possible for salt to lose its flavor. If the salt has lost its taste, how are you going to restore its saltiness? I mean, if it does get broken down, if it's been so used that it's no longer good, what are you going to do? How shall its saltiness be restored? It's no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled under people's feet. So Jesus is saying, if you don't follow the steps of the Beatitudes, you lose your flavor. And the reasons we lose our flavor are many. Why would someone who names the name of Christ lose their flavor? Well, Jesus talks about it in other places, but one of them is the cost of discipleship. The desire to be liked, to be popular, to be applauded is death to biblical Christianity. When you are saying no to what the world is saying yes to, when you don't go along to get along, when you stand up for biblical values, whether it's in your own personal lifestyle or if it's in sexual ethics or the way you think about social issues, all of that, you're just going to stand out. And when you do that, you realize there's a cost of discipleship. To follow Jesus means you're going against the way of the world. You're on the narrow road, not the broad road. And it's a hard life. And so sometimes the cost of discipleship makes those who claim to be Christians turn back and say, I don't want to do that. Sometimes it's the call of the world. That we hear the siren song of the world and we are not lashed to the mast of the Word of God, and we crash on the world's rocks. We answer the call of the world to our own destruction. Sometimes it's the conflict of persecution that in being battered and beat up, whether it be emotionally or even physically, we just don't like the conflict with the world and we give up. Sometimes it's as simple as the conceit of self-centeredness, that I don't want to follow Christ because I want to put myself first in my list of concerns. I want to do what I want to do. And we lose our flavor. But really, the way that we lose our saltiness, if you just want to sum all that up, it's Christianity without Christ. Christianity without Christ is salt without saltiness. It is worse than useless. If you don't have salt to preserve meat, you at least know, eat all of it that you can, eat it as quickly as you can, because you've got nothing to preserve it. If you have salt that's no good, that's worse, because you think you can preserve something, but you can't. And so it is, we look around, I mean, I see whole denominations now that are they are bent on self-destruction, because they're simply offering the world what the world really has already without them. They're not offering the world anything else. When you are claiming to follow Jesus, but the world says, okay, we just don't buy that stuff anymore. We don't buy your sexual ethic. We don't buy your view of marriage. We don't buy your view of the complementarity of the sexes. All that is so out of step. And so the church says, okay, well, here's what we're going to do. We're going to give on those things. But we're still going to come to church. We're still going to sing our songs. And we're still going to have little homilies. But we agree with you. We think you're right. Those things are, that's just out of step. So we're not preaching that anymore. Well, what are you left with? And what are you offering the world now? There's just simply, you're not offering them anything that's distinctive. So now, trust me, I don't think on a marketing level very well at all. But if I did, if I were merely to evaluate what the church ought to do based on pure, good old-fashioned marketing principles, I would say don't give on those things, because you're not going to have anything to offer anybody that's any different than what they have. So it makes no sense to me from purely marketing perspective. Now, that's not the basis on which we make our decisions. So let's look at it from a biblical perspective. And long ago, I settled in my mind that I either had to embrace all the Word of God or none of it. How can I argue that Jesus really rose from the dead? And I really, really believe that part. But I don't believe the part where Jesus said, male and female created he them, and said, for this cause shall a man leave his mother and father, and hold fast to his wife, and they two shall be one flesh. I'm going to edit Jesus on that. But I really believe he rose from the dead. Well, I'm just saying, how can I criticize anybody who then edits the Gospels on the resurrection? And there are plenty of people who claim to be Christians who do that. I don't know if you saw this, I'm trying to remember, I think it's a Disciples of Christ church recently that actually called an atheist as pastor. And I read the article this week, and of course it's not shocking. And their whole point was, isn't this wonderful and inclusive, and shows how we can all get along? And I just laugh at that, and I say, okay, tell me how that worked in 10 years. Let's just see your trajectory over the next 10 years. I mean, what are you? I just don't even know. How's that different than the Rotary Club? I mean, I can go to the Rotary Club and listen to a good atheist and find helpful information. I mean, atheist has a lot of things to teach me about how to organize my library, or how to fix up my house or whatever. It's not that atheists know nothing, but they have nothing to teach me about the Bible. And when we're trying to have a Christianity without Christ, we've lost our flavor. And if we say, well, we're keeping a version of Christ, we're keeping a Christ that loves the poor and feeds the hungry and includes the disenfranchised. Che Guevara can do that. I don't need Jesus for that. There are lots of people who do that. I don't need a social reconstructor. I need a Savior. I need to be saved from my sin. I need my life to be transformed. This is the Jesus we offer. And if we are not offering that Jesus, we have lost our flavor. Christianity without Christ is salt without saltiness. It's worse than useless. The clear teaching here Jesus is making is that it's time for the salt to be salty. And now he changes the metaphor to light. You are the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden. Nor do people light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a stand, and it gives light to all in the house. All right, so I have in my office, I should have brought one in. I have these little Herodian lamps. They have lamps that were used in the ancient Near East going way back, long before Jesus' time. And in Jesus' day, during the reign of Herod, they had a special little thumb squeeze on them. You can always tell a Herodian lamp. But they're just little clay lamps. And I have in my office not only the little clay lamp, but I have the little oil pots that they would keep tied to their belt with extra oil. And so they would carry this. They would have a wick in it, and they would light that. And remember the story of the 5 foolish and 5 wise virgins? The 5 wise virgins had extra oil, kept their wicks trimmed, and during the night they added oil to it. They didn't run out, so they had plenty of light until the bridegroom arrived. And so this image is used a lot in the New Testament. Jesus here talks about these lamps. In every home, there would be carved into the wall a little, like a little shelf, just a little indentation in the wall for them to put the lamp on it. And you see, black soot marks on the wall, no doubt, above it, because as the wick burned, and that it was filled with olive oil. Olive oil was their really important stuff. It was medicine, it was flavor, it was their fuel. And so they would burn that. And when you light it, what do? You put it up, you put it on a stand. You put it where it shines all over the room. You don't light it and then hide it under a pot, hide it under a pot or a bushel. You put it on a stand so that it gives light before others. And Jesus says this is what we do. This is the motive for our good works. It's that others may see that light within us, and they might glorify our Father which is in heaven. So our motive is not to get any glory for ourselves. And so people look at us and say, look what he is. Look what she does. But it's that they might see Christ in us. So living for Jesus makes you shine like light in darkness. Now, what does light do? If you light a lamp, I believe in Luke 15, doesn't the woman that loses the coin lights a lamp, I think, and sweeps the house. So she lights a lamp and she looks. So the lamp light exposes dirt when it dispels darkness. We have this big, hardwood floor hallway at our house. It's, I think, the most beautiful feature of our home. Sort of what we fell in love with when we first walked in that house. Big, old, wide oak hardwood floors. There's not a nail in them. They're all pegged, the original floors, and just beautiful. And right now the sun is too far south, but other times of the year the sun comes as it's north. It will shine in our front door window. It's just a small window, but when it lines up and it shines in on that hardwood floor, I don't care if Tanya dusted that thing the night before. By the morning time, when the sun comes in and it lights up that hallway at an angle, it's like every little thing of dust casts a shadow. So it looks awful. It looks like, she's always embarrassed. She hates the sun coming in the window because I just dusted that yesterday. I know, but there's stuff we don't see until you really put light on it, and then wow, look at that. Look at all that dust. So it is. This is why Tanya doesn't like the light shining in the front door, because it exposes that the dust, makes her look like she's not a good housekeeper. Well, this is what the light of Christ does. We think we're a good person, and then suddenly the light shines and we see all the dirt. Light exposes dirt. Light awakens people when it dispels darkness. You're sleeping well, and suddenly, and I grew up on the eastern edge of the central time zone. So in the summer, 5 o'clock in the morning, it's really bright. That sun has popped up, and I can remember as a boy wanting to sleep, the sun coming into the window, it's 5 o'clock. I don't have to get up at 5 o'clock, but boy, there's the light, and it's hard to sleep with that light. The light awakens people. The light draws attention when it dispels darkness. If you're in a dark room and suddenly somebody turns on a light, you look, where'd that light come from? Who turned that light on? What's the source of the light? It always draws attention. But you know what else? Light brings hope when it dispels darkness. I can remember many times as a boy, we'd go to Mammoth Cave National Park, and we'd go on one of those tours, and they'd be in that big cavern room, and they would tell us, okay, we're going to turn out the lights for a minute just for you to experience total darkness. Now, this is before anybody had a cell phone or watches that lit up. They turned those lights out. It was dark, and they would just let you be there in the total darkness for a moment. You didn't see anything. And I remember as a kid, I was really always ready for them to turn that light back on. And man, when they turned the light back on, okay, I feel good now. I feel comfortable now. Light brings hope. When we're in darkness, we feel hopeless. We don't know what to do. We don't know around us. We don't know our way out. Light brings hope when it dispels darkness. Now, Jesus says if you are of the light, trying to hide your light is impossible. You can't hide a city on a hill. He said a city set on a hill cannot be hidden. Now, Jesus grew up in Nazareth. And when you go to Israel and you are anywhere from Megiddo to Jezreel Valley, anywhere, you can see Nazareth. It's on a hillside. It's up just on the other side of that hill, goes down to Galilee. But man, up there you really, you see it. It's set on a hill. There's no hiding it. And if you're, put yourself back then, there's no outdoor lighting. There is no electricity. And at night, even 30 miles away, looking across the clarity of the Jezreel Valley, people up in Nazareth start lighting their lights for the evening. And there's a glow. You can see that many miles away, you can see little individual lights, and the city begins to glow. Jesus said, you can't hide it. There's no place for a city on a hill to go. It's going to stand out, and that's the way we live. We stand out. Its visibility serves both as light and landmark. So if people are traveling at night, they can see the lights of Nazareth up on the hill. They know the direction to go. It's calling to them. It's bringing them in. And that's what we do as children of the light. The purpose of the light is to illuminate. The purpose of the light is not to conceal. And Christians who want to live for Christ but keep it private are always going to live in internal conflict. Because the purpose is to be seen. Jesus says that they may see your good works and glorify your Father who's in heaven. If you're trying to, I've got my work life, then I've got my church life, that's untenable. That does not work. It's not God's design. It's not God's purpose. No. What you have is one life, and it all belongs to Jesus. And you could no more live without showing Christ at work than you can without showing Christ when you sing hymns. As a believer, You can't conceal the light. Christians who want to live differently in work or school or home or politics, if they want to live differently there than they believe internally, then they're going to always have an inner turmoil. Because the light has a way of shining in every dark corner. Your purpose and your behavior must match. And Jesus is saying that God has a purpose for you. As salt, you're to be salty, you're to preserve, you're to irritate sometimes. You're to add flavor. As light, you are to expose the dirt and awaken people and draw attention and bring hope. You can't do that silently, privately. That the whole purpose is that they may see your good works and glorify your Father who's in heaven. So God gives you a place of visibility for you to turn it into a point of influence. Jesus said, you don't light the lamp and hide it. What do? You display it. You set it in a lampstand. You put it where it has maximum value. You put it where it's going to shine the most. Paul put it like this. Remember when we studied Ephesians, that he's chosen us in him from before the foundation of the world, that we should be holy and blameless in love. So he's chosen us with that purpose. In chapter 2, when he said that he made us alive together with Christ, and he said that he has ordained good works, that we should walk in them. So God's whole purpose is that our character be changed, we should be holy and blameless in love, and that there are certain works that we should do. He's prepared works for you to do that bring glory to him. So your place of visibility very well may be public office. We need Christians to take the mantle of leadership and run for office and do so openly in their Christian faith. Sometimes people say, well, then I can't get elected. Well, why don't you let the Lord worry about that? You just run for office, run as a Christian, run with your beliefs. Don't back down from anything. Let anybody say anything about you that they want. Just let the Lord. I think we can all admit we've seen lots of people get elected to office in this country that we never thought possibly could, good and bad. And just be who you are. Be who God made you to be. Maybe your place of visibility might be tragic loss. If you've ever heard Johnny Erickson Tada speak or read any of her books, here's someone that was injured in a very tragic accident and is quadriplegic, and having a very close friend like David Miller who's quadriplegic, I know a little something about what it takes just to get up in the morning and go through morning routine, if going to the bathroom and using the shower and getting dressed. What I barely have to think about is at least a two-person job for people like that, and takes a long time. And there's no change in your mind once you get something on going, oh, this doesn't look good, let me try something else. That just never happens. And yet, when they use their tragic loss as a platform by which to tell others about what Christ has done in them, to shine their light, what a place of visibility. Your place of visibility very well may be some tragedy in your life, but to use it to point others to Christ and his sufficiency brings light. Your place of visibility might be success. Maybe God has blessed your business. Maybe God has given you a lot. How are you using that as a platform for the gospel? Your place of visibility might be sickness. How are you using your diagnosis of cancer or celiacs or leukemia, whatever you may have? How do you use that to point people to Christ and to give glory to God and to show his sufficiency? He's prepared you to do good works that bring glory to him. He wants your light to shine so others might see your good works and glorify your Father who's in heaven. So ask yourself how your situation does that. Your primary purpose is to glorify God as you illuminate people. And if you live out the Beatitudes, the world will notice, because there just aren't many people like that. And the world will persecute you, because there aren't many people like that. And the world will see your reality, and they'll glorify God. There will be people who will see in your reality a ray of hope for themselves. If the world around you is really dark, your light shines all the more brightly. And this is what we have to not fear. We cannot fear that we're doing our jobs and living our lives in a time of darkness. That is the point. That's why we're here. That's the very thing that Jesus pointed us to. And as we live out as salt and light, Jesus now points us back to the real purpose of the law. Now remember, he's giving this sermon to a bunch of Jews, mostly Galilean Jews, who are farmers and fishermen and housewives who've come out to stand in that Galilean sun, because it's almost always, storms there don't last a long time. They rush through, and so it's never just like rainy there for days on end. They're standing out there in the hot sun, listening to Jesus talk. And they have been schooled in the law. They look at the Pharisees and the rulers there in Jerusalem as these are the guys that do it right. But Jesus says, don't think that I've come to abolish the law of the prophets. I've not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly, I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not an iota, not a dot will pass from the law until all is accomplished. Therefore, whoever relaxes one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. What? Jesus said, all the law has to be fulfilled. If you say of any part of the law, well, that part's not really important. He says, then you're least in the kingdom of heaven. And whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you'll never enter the kingdom of heaven. Now that had to be a shocking and terrifying word that Jesus gives them. Jesus explains a purpose you've got to receive. Jesus said, I didn't come to destroy the law. Destroying the law brings anarchy. The abolition of the law brings anarchy. The rejection of the law brings the penalty of the law. But the fulfillment of the law brings liberty. You're only afraid of the law if you've broken it, right? Well, we've all broken it. Jesus said, I didn't come to bring the anarchy of abolition, nor the penalty of rejection. I come to bring the liberty of fulfillment. I fulfilled the law. There's nothing between the lawgiver and the subject if the law is kept. And Jesus says, I didn't come to just abolish it. I came to fulfill it. But he makes a promise in verse 18, you've got to believe. Heaven and earth will pass away, but no part of the law is going to pass away. Millions have broken the law. Only one has accomplished it, and that's Jesus. So here, I want you to see this. Matthew is picturing Jesus as one of the pictures of Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount is that he's the new Moses. Who gave the law? Moses gave the law. Moses himself breaks the law because he doesn't get to enter the promised land because God said, you didn't show me as holy. And so Moses, who gave the law, he himself breaks the law. Well, the children of Israel, they break the law before Moses comes down from Sinai. Jesus is the new Moses who's given an even higher law here, and yet he's fulfilling it. So Jesus makes a judgment you've got to accept in verse 19. And that judgment is that the law has to be kept. We don't gain anything by ignoring God's law, and we lose when we teach others to ignore it. But it's also true we cannot perfectly keep it. And then in verse 20, Jesus makes a demand you can't possibly meet. Your righteousness, he says, has to be better than the best. Who cared more about keeping the law than the Pharisees? Nobody. And Jesus says, well, you got to do better than them. Your righteousness must be better than the best, but your righteousness is as bad as the worst. So you need a righteousness that is imputed. That means it's been counted to you. It's been reckoned to you, even though you did not keep it. You need a righteousness that is adequate, that fulfills all the law, because not one little iota, not one little dot of the law is going to pass away, Jesus said. So you need a righteousness that keeps all of the law. It is imputed, it is adequate, it is perfect. So if you can't do that, if your righteousness doesn't exceed the righteousness of the Pharisees, then you need the righteousness of someone else. And so here is the second peak Jesus has built up to. He's talked to us about being salt and light, but lest we think, oh, I'm doing that. I'm such a salty, light-filled Christian. He reminds us that the basis of this of righteousness is the keeping of the law. And he says, you're not doing that. So here's now the second peak. You don't meet the Beatitudes. You're not keeping the law. Your righteousness is not the righteousness of the scribes and the Pharisees. So here now we've seen two of these little peaks where Jesus is getting across to us, you don't have righteousness. And this is the big point of the Sermon on the Mount. You don't have it, but the one who stands before us telling us we don't have it is also the one who is going to give it to us. If we ask, we seek, we knock, his righteousness is available to us. And there's the great hope. It's because we have the righteousness of Christ we can truly be salt and light. It's because we have the character and righteousness of Christ that we can truly be and live the Beatitudes. It's not ours, it's his. A righteousness that is imputed and adequate and perfect. Not because we've kept the law, but because we have been accepted by the one who did. That is our great hope.